thank you for being here and for your plenary session here at the 21st Century Trends in ELT BELTA on critical thinking.
You're welcome.
When I think about critical thinking, the first two words that pop into my mind are social media, of course. And nowadays, maybe it's quite unique, but let's say for those who still have this irrational, yet to be defined fear of social media, as a teacher, what is your advice to them? Is it necessary to be involved in social media to be able to talk about this in class or not?
Well, I think you can talk about it in class, and I think it depends on who your students are. I mean, if you have students who are clearly actively using social media, I think any teacher, if they don't necessarily know about the interests or needs of their student, their natural job is to find that out in order to tap into what interests them. So if you, for example, if you're teaching a group of students and they're active in terms of the technology and so on, and I don't think you need to be an expert to necessarily keep up with them. And I think we all have different, I see differences between what people know and don't know. So for example, you might have teenage students who are very active on certain types of apps or certain types of websites, but it always amazes me what they don't know about the technology. So if I'm using Google Docs with them or some kind of tool that we want to use in the classroom to assist with reading skills or writing or something, I kind of have to train them in those areas. So I tend to think, well, I know about that and they know about something else. And it's not really a question of who knows and who doesn't know. It's just a question of sharing those things. But my original background is in business English, and so I come from a background which the starting point is to find out about the needs of students. For example, business people, tap into those and focus on that. Well, I would have the same approach with an upper secondary school class, where I wanted to find out what their interests and needs were, and then tap into those interests. And how you can provide them the necessary. So it's not that different. I don't think the teacher has to be an expert in use of Twitter or something, but they've also got to have an awareness of what it is.
Of course, in critical thinking, there are several of tools you use to organize your activities. There's the identifying perspective. We talked with Hughes about the concept checking questions, lacking the ability to use this for vocabulary, but identifying perspective is something you can use for vocabulary. Could you elaborate on the critical thinking approach a little bit further?
It's only, my approach is really thinking that in terms of critical thinking, if you get students thinking critically and you apply certain critical thinking techniques to language learning, you're developing those critical thinking skills, but you're also developing language skills, because if you give students a critical thinking task, it forces them to discover certain things about the language. So, an important part of language teaching is getting students to discover and notice language, and I think critical thinking tasks send them in that direction. So, for example, one of the activities I did in the session today was not to get, if you give students a text, not to give them the questions to answer. Typically we get them to answer the questions of course, but actually approach the text with questioning mind and ask your own questions about the text, possibly by thinking of, if you give students a text and you say to them, what are 3 questions you have about this text before you read it? Perhaps you've looked at the photograph and the headline, and then they go into that text and search. You're developing those questioning skills and they're discovering the information for themselves. Even if they discover that the answer to the question isn't in the text, that's still perfectly valid. They're still having to read deeply and notice, and it's helping develop their reading skills. Similarly, if another exercise is to pull sentences out of a text and identify, is it a factual statement or is it expressing the author's opinion in some way? students discover something about opinion language. I mean, typically we teach students to say things like "in my opinion" or "I think," but actually they discover that in written text we rarely use that type of phrase. We tend to use adjectives to express an opinion, or we might use a phrase, or we might use language with certain connotations.
Yes.
So we looked at the difference between a word with a negative connotation in certain contexts, like difficult, versus a word with a positive connotation like challenging. And noticing that type of difference in vocabulary is partly critical thinking, it's partly lexical, but the two things are kind of working together.
And what is critical thinking for these screenagers for the future? Why is it that important to train them in these critical skills? What is your opinion on that? Why is it so important to train our students in think critically?
I think there's a kind of feeling that a lot of students are accessing more information than they've ever accessed before. They have the skills to access it. They might come across something, a text in Google or whatever. If they type something in, typically if you give your students a research task, they type it in, the first page they see is Wikipedia, they go there, they get their information, and they just assume that that information is correct, and then they produce something based on that information. Or they might search through Google and find lots of different sources, but one of the problems is they don't have the skills to check the reliability of the texts. And they can do it in different ways, but part of that is linguistic and identifying certain language features that indicate that the text may be valid or based on something valid. So I think in terms of it's helping students with ideas of when is a text reliable, when is it useful for their work, when is it not wise to just copy that information and regurgitate it, because of course the information or the source might be not valid in some way.
Definitely. You provided us with a valuable amount of hands-on activities during the plenary session. If we as trainees or teachers in English are interested in this view on critical thinking, where can we find more information about it?
About 2 or 3 years ago I did some work in Italy with some Italian teachers, because the Italian Ministry of Education wanted to introduce critical thinking, and the teachers wanted help with looking at language activities that were developing critical thinking. And the product of that was a short booklet called Critical Thinking in the Language Classroom, and it's a free booklet. It was to help teachers, but it's available to any teachers in any country, and it has a sort of clear definition, rationale, and then 20 activities, and you can download it for free if you go to my blog elteachertrainer.com and click on the Critical Thinking tab. You can download it there. I'm also involved with some books by National Geographic, and we've included critical thinking components in the different levels there, particularly linked to the reading texts. So that's another source to take a look at those books and see how we've approached critical thinking within language teaching.
Thank you very much. Have a good flight.
All right, thank you.